So rationally, we all know that things like emotions aren't linear, especially grief. And if you're in the middle of ending a relationship or losing a relationship, or you're in a completely different healing process than the person that is in the relationship with you, then you're going to have some asymmetry. And one of the things that the professional that I refer to a lot, Robert Terris, and I are talking about in this next video is about the grief process and what it's like to try to get into a situation where you're working on a separation, but both parties are in very different places. So I always find this, and he did too, that coming into a place where people just want to fight about the relationship one more time, like their perspective, why it didn't work, what that other person didn't do right. And sometimes when the relationship is over, it takes a lot more time for the people to grieve what happened and where they are now, especially if someone is moving away from them. So, because he comes from the aspect of being a therapist, lawyer, and a mediator, he can put on different hats in some of the processes and meet the individual separately to really look at the places where they might be stuck in their emotional aspect of grief and really work on that aspect so that they can heal and grow and change, even if they don't want to face a situation. If a relationship is changing, the situation has to be faced. And sometimes closure is a very internal process that people have to go into, but it's always better to do that on your own in a therapeutic session or with other kinds of emotional support than doing that in a lawyer mediator session, because it's just not the right place for it. But you have to suss out when people are going through relationship issues and challenges and endings and separation that they are going to be bringing with them in the session all these emotional issues, and to discern which ones you're going to refer out, which ones you're going to focus on, and how you're going to know people are ready to do this piece of work is critical. So I love talking to the professionals I refer to. I think we have rich conversations that help me understand more about what I'm doing with clients and really get to explore what they do with clients too. So hopefully the clients that do, I refer to them, can actually see this video and learn a lot about this professional before they go and meet them, and to make sure that they're the right person for them, like-minded, all of that. So I hope you enjoy this grief conversation that I'm having with Robert Terris about the loss of relationship. Hey, Robert, I'm so glad I have you back on to talk with me about the stages of grief and how they manifest themselves in a mediation process. So thanks for taking the time to talk to me about that today.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
So where do you want to start?
Yes, well, I've been reflecting a lot, since I do mediation, I'm both an attorney and a therapist. I've been reflecting recently about how the stages of grief, um, which are usually people experience when there's been a death of a loved one, manifest themselves in the mediation setting because people are grieving the loss of their relationship, and the loss of kind of their expectations about what the family dynamic would look like and their romantic relationship would look like. And they manifest themselves in very particular ways within the mediation session. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about. So, for a reminder for your clients, those stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression or sadness, and acceptance. Um, and typically, when you're grieving a loved one, the death of a loved one, they manifest themselves in kind of denial. I can't believe this hasn't happened. This person can't really be dead. Anger that the person has passed away, and you are now have to confront life without them. Bargaining, kind of wishing, well, what could I have done? Is there anything I can still do so that this reality is not my reality? Um, Depression and sadness is actually then allowing your vulnerable emotions to come to the fore, and then obviously acceptance is, okay, this person has really passed away, and I need to accept that and to grieve. So the way this manifests in the mediation setting is, and I'll start with the first one, denial, is people often come into the mediation, um, which is purportedly in order to discuss and negotiate the separation of their finances and how they're going to co-parent together. But they have an unconscious need to relitigate the relationship itself. um, I think with partly with the hope that they will persuade the other person to change, or
Mm-hmm.
persuade the other person to take ownership um, for the dysfunction in the relationship,
Uh-huh.
or hoping that the mediator, who's supposed to be a neutral, will actually adjudicate the relationship and state in this now, mini public forum, who's right and who's wrong. Um, and the reason that I put this as kind of denial is because, one, if you've spent so much time and effort trying to save your relationship, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to save it now in the mediation setting. Two, the mediator is not really showing up there as an adjudicator. They're showing up as a neutral, whose job is to facilitate your conversations and to facilitate um, generating proposals for you all to reach a settlement, a financial settlement, and also your co-parenting agreements.
Mm-hmm.
But the pull, but if I look at this with compassion, because and as a natural progression, right, the pull to relitigate the relationship and to have a new party in the room, a neutral party in the room, is very strong. Um, because I think people, it's hard to accept that that person can't fundamentally change. It's hard
Right.
to accept that something can't be done to fix this relationship. And it's kind of this hope of, maybe if this mediator will just say something or show the other person that they were wrong, then we can somehow salvage the relationship.
Yeah, I see that. I sometimes I think it's the need for closure, right? And maybe it's a trying to get to closure or trying to get to reviving the relationship. Like, is there one last ditch effort we can do with this person? Are they going to see the light? And then we don't have to deal with this. Is that kind of what you see people coming in at this stage being?
Yes, I think that's profound, kind of this idea of closure. Because I think at a minimum, I think you're right. Even if people are resigned that this relationship is not going to succeed, the element of closure would be, okay, well, at least it wasn't my fault.
Right,
Or,
right,
you
exactly.
know, a third person's weighing in and seeing that it's actually the other person's fault. And I think it is hard for people to move on without that sense of closure, without having a sense of finality, a final adjudication, which is either internal or external,
Right,
of who was at fault. And I think that perhaps is a grasp at needing to move on with a sense of closure. And I think the painful part of often divorce and the mediation process is you need to move on even without that sense of closure,
right.
without that sense of emotional closure, because there are very practical, both
Mm.
logistical, financial, and if you have children, issues that need to be resolved, right, very concretely
Right,
in order
right.
for you to separate.
So coming into the mediation, wanting to litigate the relationship one more time or just get some backup, like, yes, I'm in the clear. It wasn't everything. I did everything I could. This person didn't change. Um, it's interesting because then I think what ends up happening is if they can't get closure in order to move on, I see this a lot in my groups, is that they have to create that closure story for themselves to be able to move forward. Um, but I think we're talking about people coming in sort of that first stage of just like letting you see what the elements of the relationship are that they're still struggling with. And they need to somehow put that forth so they can discuss the rest of it. Like, let me understand this. Let me find a way to close this chapter out. Let me figure out how not to feel so bad about it. And that's what they're asking you. So how do you deal with that? Do you just label it, name it for them that they're doing that?
Well, yes. I mean, I would say in my role as the mediator, I try and surface what's going on in the room explicitly and say to people, okay, I am viewing here what we're doing is relitigating the relationship. Is that really how you want to spend your time and money? Second, do you think it's going to be effective? You know, have you have you trod this ground before? Has this seem familiar for you? This discussion that you've had, with your couples counseling or whatever.
Right.
And usually people then, if I'm able to surface it, they will recognize the futility of of this, of the endeavor of relitigating the relationship in this moment. And that's enough to kind of bring them back and get them refocused. Um, I am curious, because I thought I heard you say that part of your work is to help that closure happen internally with a self
Right.
narrative, and I'm
Right.
I'm kind of curious how you do that with
Well,
your
I think
clients.
it's interesting because I think probably you're doing similar things that I'm doing is like when people walk in a room, whether they're coming to me in a discernment process to figure out if they want to separate, and then they're kind of giving me sort of the scary scenarios of not being together and that they might not be able to handle it is one sort of view that I sometimes see. And they're sort of playing out this fantasy of separating, right? And if the relationship is ready to do that, or if there's some kind of one last stitch effort that can be made to pull it together. And that really depends on where everybody is, right? Because sometimes somebody's very committed to, no, I'm ready, and doesn't really matter where that other person is. So I'm curious that you might see, just like I see, is like a couple coming in very different grief stages and how to negotiate that in the room. So if people aren't ready to talk about the ending of the relationship and how they're going to deal with the finances and the legal matter, like how do you handle those moments? I know how I handled those moments myself. I just kind of label them and talk about the differences there, and are we able to like still have a conversation even though people are having very different experiences about where they are in the relationship ending or the relationship decision, right? So I wonder if when you're asking them, how do you want to spend your time, it's almost like since you have both roles of therapist and lawyer, you could step back there and say, we could work on where you're at in the relationship and how you're both in different places, or we could step into the mediation. Like how do you get people to
Yeah.
identify and make that choice?
Yeah. So that's a good question and a good point about the asymmetry in terms of the grieving process. And people come in often with they're at different stages internally in terms of where they are grieving the relationship, and how ready they are to move on. I will clarify that, why I'm a licensed attorney and a licensed therapist. When I'm mediating, I'm really there as more as a mediator, more with the attorney hat. I think that
Right.
the fact that I'm a therapist allows me to be attuned to and sensitive to these emotional dynamics.
Uh-huh.
But I'm not doing therapy in the room, kind of concretely with people. On a rare exceptions, I will ask people, I'll say, hey, is there's kind of, do we need to have a closure session about the relationship itself? Would it be helpful for us to spend an hour talking about, trying to get closure, talking about what each person's willing to take ownership for in the relationship, and acknowledge what needs were met and which needs were not met and what their role is in that. So occasionally, very occasionally, I'll do that. But more often, to answer your question, if I see that there's asymmetry in where people are at in the grieving process, so one, yes, is to kind of name it in the room.
Mhm.
So it's just kind of manifest and clear why people are having different emotional reactions or, focus differently. Two, that might be a reason to caucus, which is to have separate sessions with people. So in my mediation sessions, I would say the majority of the time I'm having a joint session with both parties, but I often frequently will ask, or the parties will ask, to meet separately, and for a variety of different reasons. But one reason might be because of this asymmetry, and I have to kind of help an individual catch up to the grieving stage,
Right.
or just to give them enough validation and empathy for where they're at, right? that they can then refocus on the task at hand, which is kind of this separation and all the logistics and all the financial aspects.
So would you go back and forth, like doing speaking to them separately and then trying to pull them back in together, especially if you're on video, or would you just stay separate?
So it depends, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later as we get to another stage of the process. But like in this scenario where perhaps I'm noticing some asymmetry in people's focus or emotionally what they're ready for, I may surface it, say to the person who's farther along in the grieving process, I think it would be helpful for me to meet with your partner separately because here's what I'm noticing, and I want to check in with them, and so then I may spend 30 minutes with them, check in again with the other person, but that might be a shorter process, a shorter amount of time, because again they're just in a different place and ready to move on with the process. So there's
Right,
may not be symmetry in the amount of time that I spend with people in this
right,
instance of
right.
people being
And
along
I
of.
think we're talking about like the grief stages are not linear, right? And that even in a discussion, people can land into different stages that might stop the process, or you're realizing like I think both of us in our experiences are reading like where is the person at, how is the couple at, where are they, how are we getting them to be productive in this conversation, and where are they stopping and stuck, right? And then identifying that and continuing to try to keep them in some kind of process that they're actually asking us for. Like keep us in this container that we're moving forward somehow, even if one of us doesn't want to, right? We're here
Yeah.
for a reason, right? We've tried everything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is I think the expectation of the professional is to move them along and be
Right.
kind of aware and sympathetic to that grieving process. And yes, as you stated, it's not linear, it's circular, you
Right.
know. Hopefully it follows some trajectory which is moving forward, but yes, it's kind of circular and people.
Right. So it wouldn't be unusual to have someone coming in denial that might appear like as being non-cooperative, and the other person in anger because they're like using their anger to create boundaries, and it's an action and an action emotion. So they're in that place where they're wanting to take action. So it's not unusual. And the clinician or the practitioner really has to figure out like how they're going to manage that situation um,
Yeah.
to to keep having conversations that make sense.
Yeah. And so that's a good segue, I think, to the next stage of the grieving process, which
Yeah.
is anger. So often people come in with a lot of anger. I think it's natural that
Yeah.
their expectations have been dashed. Often events have occurred in the relationship which are very painful and frustration. And so they either objectively rightly have a lot of reason to be angry, or just subjectively they're just very upset.
Mhm.
um, and so I think it's natural. I try and warn clients that that could be an inevitable part of the process.
Right.
Sometimes I get clients who mutually agreed to separate, are highly motivated to maintain a friendship, and the energy is fairly collaborative and positive, and often there's a lot of anger and frustration. So I just try and highlight that might be an inevitability as part of this process, and to encourage everybody to ride the waves of those emotions. And depending on how the anger level in the room, or what I like to say is how limbic kind of my clients are. So, because if you're very angry, you can often have a flight, fight, or freeze response, and that manifests itself in the room, in terms of communication and people's willingness to do homework and how prepared they are. But that would be a reason to have a caucus. And again, this separate session. So
Right.
if I'm assessing that the joint session, either at this stage, like this month, or this particular session, is just
Right.
so high, the anger's too intense, that would be a reason for me to say, okay, hey, here's what I'm noticing. I think it would be helpful to experiment that I meet with you all separately in either separate rooms or separate virtual rooms if it's via Zoom. and for us to be able to review and assess proposals, again, these concrete financial proposals, when we're not dealing with the limbic energy and the emotional energy between
Yeah.
you two.
Uh-huh.
And let's trial it and see if you all are experiencing that as more effective.
Hmm. And what do
Um,
you, I mean, typically, what do you find?
so usually if I am suggesting that we caucus, then
Yeah.
usually I'm on to something, and
Right.
the parties are appreciative that I'm separating them and giving them the ability to show up with their left brain, and to really address the task at hand and not have to deal with the other person's energy. So usually they're appreciative.
Yeah. I can see that because I think sometimes the person represents the grief, right? So it's like they can't use their left side of their brain at that moment when they're, feeling like they're back in their grief.
Yeah,
Can't communicate. Mhm.
yeah, exactly. And just kind of a extricating that trigger, or that grief from the space, from the physical
Yeah.
space, allows the person to then participate meaningfully in the process.
Yeah, I'm always amazed when I'm doing like even to work out different parenting agreements that if I just separate them in a Zoom session, for example, like they basically want the same thing. They just can't hear each other at all. And when they're in the room, you can't you hear that they have to kind of contradict the other person as a way of just I don't know, litigating the relationship again, like I'm right, you're wrong, or whatever it might be. But it's amazing how people, once they are in the left brain, they can actually calm down enough to see there's only a few scenarios here that are going to work for our family. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I think and a reason, another reason to surface this, in this kind of forum and in this video, is also to help clients self-assess. Wow, I'm just filled with so much anger. I know my better self should allow me to be in the room and work collaboratively with this person, but I
Right.
self-assessing, I can't. I'm filled with anger. I would like to request that we meet in a caucus, or that we set up the mediation from the get-go.
Right. Right.
Um,
It's a great thought. It's like, how can the client who's even listening to this like be more prepared themselves emotionally to approach this process, right? Because it's an important process, and you really want to assess like where is my sort of weak spots? How can I be a little bit more together myself? Like, what am I do I need to have like a friend in the waiting room? Do I need to make sure that I have just had a therapy session? Whatever it is that's going to help you prepare, and to give yourself time afterwards too, because I feel like it's a big conversation. A lot comes up.
yes, and another reason that I'm kind of surfacing this is I try and encourage my clients to be very proactive in the process of the mediation itself, of asserting what their needs are, surfacing what their needs are,
Right.
and not necessarily just relying on the mediator. Because as an example in this, I know there are a lot of mediators in divorce setting who believe that they will only do mediation in a joint session for purposes of transparency, for purposes of neutrality. Um, so um, so either they're kind of ideologically committed to a joint session, or their default is always to have joint sessions, and they'll just kind of stay in that forum, um,
Yeah.
in terms of inertia. So I think it's also important for clients to know that, hey, this is an option. And maybe if I'm self-assessing that today or in general, my anger level's so high, it would be better to request a caucus.
Right. Right. So we have the anger, the stage of anger is like really important to identify as like a grief stage. Very obvious when it comes walking in your room.
Yes, yes. So the next dynamic that I often see in my mediation process, which I think mirrors the bargaining stage of grief,
Mhm.
um, is that people are hoping that the mediator can somehow fundamentally change the behavior of their soon-to-be ex.
Right.
Um, and and I put this under kind of the bargaining rubric because it's okay. Now we have a new person in the room. And if I can just elicit that new person to somehow wield the carrot or the stick, you know, for my ex, my soon to be ex, then the way that they show up, the way they showed up in the relationship, you know, stonewalling or uncommunicative or bad communicator or disdain or, all these different things, all of a sudden these will go away because the mediator will somehow make this person behave in a way that was 100% different than how they showed up in the relationship.
Right.
And obviously there is some ameliorative effect to being in a mediation, having a third person there. Hopefully people are showing up with their better selves, if not their best self. And I think the mediator can kind of set some guidelines, particularly in the room. But I think it's important that people be aware that the mediator can't solve problems that were, if you spend 20 years in marriage, the mediator is not all of a sudden going to change that person in the mediation process.
Right.
And there's a limit to what the mediator can do. They're not a judge, they're not an adjudicator. If they wield a carrot or a stick, the stick is a weak one in terms of you know um checking in, trying to hold people accountable. Hey, how come you haven't done your homework? I want to remind you to speak in a respectful tone. Like, there's kind of weak ways. Um,
Mhm.
and the main carrot is, look, do you all want to spend hundreds of that potentially hundreds of $1,000s in litigation, or do you want to try and work this out in mediation? But if people aren't fundamentally buying in to showing up with their best selves in the mediation process and being 100% constructive, the mediator does not have a magic wand to change, who that person
Right.
is. And I do occasionally experience my clients' frustration that, hey, Robert, how come you can't change this person's behavior? Like, I've written emails asking for homework from my partner, and he hasn't gotten back to me. Solve that problem,
Right.
and I can check in, etc. But I can't fundamentally change, let's say, someone who's not communicative. Uh,
Right. It's
as
kind
an
of being back
example.
in fantasy, right? Bargaining in some ways. Fantasy about like this person might change. And if they change, or I actually make it easy for them, then we're going to be okay again. Even okay in the separation process, right? But it's really hard when those characteristics, sort of those chronic characteristics of disconnect come up in a mediation. Is like you're at that point, you're not into, I mean, they're not asking for intervention. No one's asking to change, right? At that point, it's kind of like a last stitch effort to like, can you make this right for us? Can you make it easier? And I think that's the asymmetry showing up again too, is that is the person that's not cooperating in another stage of grief, like denial, meaning like I'm just not gonna accept this reality. Or is something like the law, is there some kind of guiding principle of the law that helps push it forward at that point?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's very wise what you said. I think, in my experience, the main catharsis, that my clients experience, it's, let's say, 6 months post separation, like post they finish the mediation process, they have a settlement agreement, and now they're done for 6 months, and their gaze has turned outward instead of towards the relationship.
Right.
Then they're able really to kind of see a new horizon, focus on new ways to get their needs met. And when I check in with them, usually that's where the catharsis occurs, as opposed to in the mediation process itself or in the room.
Right.
Um, Obviously, where this is challenging is, to one extent, the mediator's primary job is to get the couple separated peacefully and in a way that's financially viable, etc. If you still have children and you have to co-parent together, right?
Right.
That separation can never be complete. And you still have to either deal with or collaborate with or communicate with, depending on how you characterize it, with that other person.
In some way,
And
shape, or form, even if you're not co-parenting, if you're parallel parenting, you still have to, some way, shape, or form, be connected.
yes,
Mhm.
yes. which makes the kind of letting go of the bargaining part difficult, right?
Yes.
Because I still have to work with this person. Now,
Yeah.
please change this person so I can continue working with them, even in a
Right.
limited.
Right. So I can continue parenting with them and not have the same struggle. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I think that, when we go into the next stage of grief of like depression and sadness is like sometimes just like denial, I think sometimes that stage of being not capable or of being able to work through that emotion is also another stuck space that, a client can get into, especially in the asymmetry where you're still looking at one person pushing something forward and another person really being stuck in their grief about moving forward. What do you
Yes.
think about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, related to that, so I think another difficult part, and that manifests in this bargaining, is that often one parent is concerned, not only about their co-parenting relationship and their ability to communicate and collaborate, but how is this parent going to show up for my children
Right.
when they're not in my custody? And so some of that bargaining is also like, hey, Robert, try and help me so that this person shows up as a better emotional or logistic or whatever parent. And then coming back to your point, sometimes what I do need to communicate to people is this acceptance,
Hmm.
or the sadness phase of, yes, not only do you need perhaps that you are going to have to just experience the sadness that this person cannot meet your emotional and romantic needs, but this person may not be the ideal parent, and there's some sadness there, and this is the parent that your children have. And really, what the best that you can do is to be able to hold the space for the children, be able to hold their parallel emotional sadness, if that's the case, give them the ability to talk about their feelings, and frankly, um, try and equip them so that they can express their sadness or their needs directly with the other parent. I find that it almost never works when the ex is trying
Yeah.
to advocate for the child.
Right.
Like that message never gets heard. And where if there's hope of this parent's going to fundamentally change themselves, is if the child can clearly speak to them what their needs are.
Hmm.
Um, and that really creates the motivation. So I think there's some sadness for that worrying parent, that they kind of this loss of agency, that they're not going to be there.
Right.
Obviously there's
Going to
a
be the
sadness
buffer.
around loss of connection because they're not going to be with their children as much as they want to be. And
Right.
also this loss of control, that they can't help their child navigate um,
Mhm.
every second, every minute of every day when the child's in the custody of the other parent. And there's just some inevitable sadness there.
Right. And I think we're talking about acceptance, like not maybe the stage of acceptance, but maybe that is a part of the stage of acceptance is you're not going to be able to change this person, and Robert's not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to. And part of it is they have to accept sort of the new parenting relationship in all its flaws as well, and how their child, also deal with that. So there's a lot of like facing reality in the mediation, like facing the reality of what's the future holding once its decisions are made. What does the
Yes.
future look like?
Yes. And I don't want to give the impression, like, I don't want to push people to the acceptance, right? Because I think there is a circular dynamic of sadness, acceptance, so it's kind of embracing and willing to
Right.
sit with the reality of, I'm not going to be there for my children, and this is a less than ideal family dynamic and situation, and have empathy with how that feels. You feel vulnerable as a parent. There is this loss of control, like to have empathy with yourself, sit with your sadness, acknowledge it, and then, to your point, and also be like, okay, and I have to accept that's where we're at. This
Right.
is the stage. I have chosen to divorce. Hopefully in the long run this will be better for the children. And anyway, so just to be able
Yeah.
to navigate just going back and forth between those two
Right.
stages.
So when we think about the work that you do all around with clients and the insight that you have. What do you feel like is the thing that keeps you the most in the work? What keeps you feeling like you're wanting to do it, like to do it, feel like it's a benefit?
Yes. I well, first of all, one thing is my ability when I'm able to connect to my clients as people, as humans, who are going through a difficult time, um, but also you know, um, are interesting, compassionate, funny, it's kind of they're showing up at the kind of the worst moment in their lives, but they're also just humans. And I saw the human connection for me in work in general, right, is a motivator. I think more kind of ideologically or philosophically, it's this idea of like that this is a very difficult moment in people's lives, and can I kind of Sherpa them through this in a way which is going to minimize their damage, and it's partly my knowing what's on the other side of the mediation process, which are divorce. And I mean, I've literally had clients. I had a client who spent $1.8 million as part of the litigated divorce process. That's
Wow.
extreme, but I definitely regularly have clients who spent $500,000 on the divorce process. And so that's the financial toll, but also I think there's an emotional toll when, I've had, just as an example, litigating attorneys tell me if they litigate custody, there's going to be blood on the wall. That's what they've told me, because there's just no way to litigate custody in which you're not vilifying the other parent. Because if you're trying to get anything other than 50-50,
Right.
you have to vilify the other parent. And the whole process, I just feel, of litigating, particularly around divorce, is just, you can feel very vulnerable. It's very public. It's very disruptive. In my experience, lawyers either don't or can't really insulate their clients from all the negativity that occurs within the litigation process. I wish they could. Maybe
Right.
it's just like, here, litigate, and then you don't hear from your lawyer for 2 years, and they come back later and like, okay, here's the final result. Like, that might be a good process,
Right.
but
Right.
but but that's not what actually happens. So anyway, so it's trying to get people through this process in a way which is still probably going to be painful, have elements of pain and disruption and frustration, but it's so much better than the alternative.
So much more
Um,
humane, where you
yeah,
actually, maybe with the wisdom of being with so many clients over the years, that you can actually see these patterns and really, sit down and talk to people straight up around how they might work through it a little bit easier, be a little bit easier on themselves, or make the process easier for themselves. Um, I think also just like identifying the stage of grief they're in is a huge empathetic intervention right there, because I think that helps people feel seen and heard, and um, and that it's not that it is purely highly emotional, and just to see somebody in the worst stage of their, it's a pretty hard chapter of life, and to be sort of this human element that's really holding them in that time is amazing. I think, it's hard and amazing. Right.
yeah, yeah, and to get people again to the other side of the tunnel, where 6 months
Mhm.
later they can say, okay, I'm in a much better place.
Right.
Because it's hard, referencing a former video that we did, it's hard to be stuck in a relationship in which your needs are not being met.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's kind of very sad, too. So I think there
Right.
is, value to helping people extricate themselves for what they've self-identified as a bad situation.
Right. So that's kind of why we do our work, right, Robert? Is to ease the process for people, and to get them to feel like they can connect with themselves when they're in this process, knowing that they can trust kind of the professionals they've picked to get them through it. So I'm always really thankful to have these conversations with you. I think they're just reminds me of how much of experts we both are in our fields, that we've just, really been able to hold people in really hard spaces. And I think that's, it's an honor. I always feel like it's an honor for me to work in those positions with people. And I know you feel that way too. So it's always good to know a colleague like you. So
Yes,
thanks for being one of those ones for me.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you creating this forum for us to discuss these issues and and um, and include your clients and kind of these ideas and
Yeah,
um,
because education is power, right? Just being able to, be a little thoughtful during this time is incredibly powerful, I think.
yeah, yes.
So thanks again for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
My
And
pleasure.
we'll be in touch.
My pleasure, Susan.